The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Chapter 17. Death and Resurrection. We have earlier spoken of the treatment of death and resurrection in the fertility philosophy. The ancients knew well that life and death are merely facets of the same creative process. To have crops in the spring, the land must die in the autumn, and many of their myths deal with the killing of nature after the harvest, and bringing into life with the new agricultural year. This same experience of death and resurrection is no less at the heart of the more sophisticated forms of the fertility cult, the mystery religions of which Christianity is the best known example. It seemed to the mystics that it might be possible to enact, within the mind and body, a spiritual death and resurrection, so that, however anchored the mortal frame might be to a terrestrial existence, the soul could be released as if death, and given the freedom they believed it had experienced before birth, and would do so again at death. Thus, Josephus says of the Essenians, "It is a fixed belief of theirs that the body is corruptible, and its constituent matter impermanent, but that the soul is immortal and imperishable. Emanating from the finest ether, these souls become entangled, as it were, in the prison house of the body, to which they are dragged down by a sort of natural spell. But when once they are released from the bonds of the flesh, then, as though liberated from a long servitude, they rejoice and are borne aloft." The way to this release of the soul was by asceticism, and particularly by fasting, but the same effects could be achieved and more quickly by the use of drugs, like those Josephus says the Essenians sought out, which make for the welfare of the soul and body. Above all, the sacred fungus, the Amanita muscaria, gave them the delusion of a soul floating free over vast distances, separate from their bodies, as it still does to those foolish enough to seek out the experience. The Christians put the matter thus: if the Christ is in you, although your bodies are dead through sin, your spirits are alive through righteousness. If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his spirit, which dwells in you. Not only could the drug contained under the skin of the sacred fungus give to the initiate at will this illusion of spiritual resurrection, of victory over death, but in the conception and growth of the mushroom he could see a microcosm of the whole natural order. Before his eyes the cycle of life and death was enacted in a matter of hours. The Amanita muscaria was the medium of spiritual regeneration, and at the same time in itself the supreme example of the recreative process in the world of nature. No wonder the fungus attracted so much awesome wonder among the ancients, or that it inspired some of the literature's greatest epics. To the mystic, the little red-topped fungus must have seemed human in form and yet divine in its power to change men and give them an insight into the mysteries of the universe. It was in the world, but not of it. In the New Testament myth, the writers tried to express this idea of the duality of nature by portraying as its central character a man who appeared human enough on the surface, but through whom there shone a godlike quality which manifested itself in a miracle-working and uniquely authoritative attitude to the law. The extent to which they succeeded can be seen today in the mingled sympathy and awe with which Jesus is regarded in the Western world, even among people for whom the Christian religion offers no attractions. The myth of the dying and rising God is variously treated within the mushroom cycle. One of the best-known stories is that of Persephone, Kore, her mother Demeter, and the wicked uncle Pluto. The beautiful virgin, who is the heroine of the tale, presents in her double name the equivalent of the effeminate male, hermaphrodite. Her two names can now be seen as two aspects of the mushroom, Persephone being the vulva, container, or the penis of fecundity, and Kor, the stem of the phallus. Sumerian, Gu-Rai, as in the storm god's name, Ush-Gup-Ja, Iskaru. Put in other fungus folklore terms, Kor is the charmed and erect serpent, thrusting open the egg of Persephone. It is with this sense that Sem-U-Ni comes into Hebrew, in the form of Siphoni, adder, which has a specific mushroom reference in a passage in Isaiah. The prophet warns that those who split the eggs of the Siphoni adder will bring death upon themselves, and those who weave with spiders' spindles, Kur, the spindle rod with its whorl, will never weave such a web as it will cover their cultic practices. Doubtless, both these expressions will have been common folk names for the mushroom. Persephone, Kor, was passionately loved from afar by her uncle Pluto, god of the underworld. Although her father Zeus approved of the match, her mother Demeter, listed along with her daughter's names among those of the holy plant, strongly objected to the arrangement, not least because the marital home would have been outside her influence. However, Pluto, with the connivance of his brother, arranged that a large and beautiful flower should one day appear at the feet of his beloved as she walked in her Sicilian home. Unable to resist the blossom, the girl picked it, and immediately a yawning chasm appeared at her feet, revealing her suitor, complete with chariot and horses to carry her off struggling to his subterranean palace. Not unnaturally, her mother was upset by the turn of events and began a long and variously recounted search for her daughter. Unhappily, even when she discovered her whereabouts, it was to find that the hapless child had eaten some magic herb that made it impossible for her to leave Hades forever. An agreement was finally reached that she would remain in her husband's home for a third of the year, or half, and spend the rest of the time on Earth with her mother. It has seemed strange to scholars that Pluto, the god of the underworld, should elsewhere be reckoned as a god of fertility. It is true that much of our Western classical and Semitic tradition has led us to think of Hades as a place of dull lifelessness, or even of retributive torture of the damned. More original, as we have seen, is the conception of the earth's bowels as the seat of creation, where all life is conceived, and after death recreated. And in the subterranean oven, the god's seminal fluid is processed into living matter, and the Word made flesh. The name Pluto, Greek Ploton, is primarily a fertility word, now recognizable as coming from an original Sumerian, Buru Tun, deliverer of the womb, of which the element buru, deliverer, release, is cognate with the Greek bruo, teem with, be full, burst forth. The same Sumerian word appears in such names as Apollo, Aphrodite, from which comes our aphrodisiac, and the plant name Abratanon, southern wood, a sprig of which under the pillow, Pliny tells us is the most effective countercheck of all to magical potions given to produce sexual impotence. A story with similar ending to that of Persephone's myth is found related of Castor and Pollux. Following Castor's death in battle at the hands of his cousins who had driven away some cattle, brother Pollux was cast into despair. At last, in answer to a prayer to Zeus that he too might die and leave this earth to rejoin his twin in Hades, Father Zeus agreed that he might spend one day with his peers, the gods, and the other in the earth with his brother. Thus, says Homer, these two, the earth, the giver of life, covers albeit alive, and even in the world below they have honor from Zeus. One day they live in turn, and one day they are dead, and they have honor like unto that of the gods. The death and resurrection story of Jesus follows the traditional pattern of fertility mythology, as has long been recognized. The hero is miraculously born, dies violently, returns to the underworld, and is then reawakened to new life. We may now go further and connect the details of the story more closely to the mushroom culture, of which it is part. Indeed, the reference is plain within the text, where Jesus is made to relate his coming death by being raised up, with the brazen serpent of Moses. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up, so that all who believe in him shall have everlasting life. The references to the incident the recorded in Numbers 21:9. And Moses made a brazen serpent and put it on a signpost, so that if anyone was bitten by a snake, he might look on the brazen serpent and live. Easter and its Dionysic equivalent. Every springtime, the Christian world celebrates its Easter festival, when the church focuses attention on the death and resurrection of Jesus. In the ceremony of the sacred fire and the dipping of penis candles into a womb font, previously noted, tradition demonstrates clearly the sexual nature of the occasion. We are now able to draw some important parallels between the Christian festival and the spring feast of the Dionysic Anthesteria. On the 12th of the month, bearing that name, end of February to the beginning of March, there began a 3-day festival of 3 parts: the Pythogia, Chois, and Chutroi. All too little is known from the records of the details of this great occasion. Inevitably, mystery rites were involved, which were not for public viewing or recording. However, we are in a better position now to probe its secrets, not least because we can decipher its names. In the first place, Pythogia had nothing to do with wine, jars, Pythoi. Indeed, the Anthesteria was not primarily a vine festival at all, despite early traditions to that effect, and Bacchus, Dionysus, was not really a wine god. For all the colorful imagery that the name has long evoked, the confusion arose mainly through the vine cluster, symbolism that formed such an important part of the Bacchic regalia. The vine cluster, like the ivy cluster, which also appears freely, represented in Bacchic symbolism, evoked the shape of the conical end of the erect penis, the glans. The form is well illustrated in the earliest Sumerian ideogram for the vine. The connection is explicit in the old names for the vine cluster, like the Greek botrys and Hebrew eshkoi, both derived, as we now realize, from Sumerian phrases meaning top of the erect penis. So the Bacchic worshippers symbolized their god's phallic and mushroom connections by carrying with them a long rod, entwined with ivy, and bearing at its end a vine or ivy cluster. This staff is called Thyrsus, womb favorer, penis, as its Sumerian derivation now shows it to have originally meant. A modern Arabic version of the name is used for the mushroom. During the course of the Athenian festival of Skira, 2 male votaries of the goddess Athena, just as girls, carry vine clusters between the temple of their goddess and that of Dionysus. The rare Greek word given to these objects, oskos, we may now relate through its original Sumerian form to the Hebrew eshkol, vine cluster, and the Song of Songs. The Shulamite's breasts are likened to such vine clusters, where the reference is certainly to the mushroom cap. The vine cluster became then a useful synonym for the sacred mushroom, and is used with this allusion in a composite picture of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, given in the post-biblical book of Enoch. We noticed earlier how Josephus used this quaint literary device to portray in a roundabout way the phallic and mushroom significance of the high priest's helmet. A number of plants are brought together to illustrate various aspects of the actual object being cryptically described. Taken at their face value, the resultant picture is absurd. But each of the plants so adduced contains some allusion, by shape, or simply by a pun on its name, which to the initiated conveys the intended meaning of the whole. And in the case of the tree of life, whose fruit made Adam and Eve like gods. The apocryphal writing says it had the height of a fir, leaves like a carob, and fruit like a vine cluster. Each of the comparisons bears upon the sacred mushroom, the Amanita muscaria. The fir, because it is a denizen of the conifer forests. The carob, because this pod name was given to both the mushroom and the food of pigs and prodigal sons. And the vine cluster, because the red cap of the fungus was so pictured, as we saw above. The luckless sons of the prophets who found death in the pot, when Elisha came to dinner, picked their mushrooms from a vine of the field. This phrase has all the appearance of folk name for the fungus, as vine of the earth has been preserved in Syriac as a name of the mandrake. The same expression is used in the book of Revelation for the harvest to which the angel with the sharp sickle is bidden. Put in your sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. It is the same imagery of the vine mushroom that described Jesus as the true vine, and in Jewish Christian literature as the vine of David. So whatever refreshment cheered the hearts of the Bacchic revelers, we may be quite sure that it was not just wine, and the vine imagery of their regalia conveyed to the initiates a more potent means of intoxication than the juice of the grape alone. And very probably, it was dried and powdered form of the Amanita muscaria that they used to lace their drink, and it was with this fiery beverage that they washed down the mushroom tops they chewed. In any case, many of the more important Dionysic festivals took place in winter, when vine culture had little to offer as an excuse for a wine-bibbing orgy. The second and third days of the Anastaria were called hoi kois and hoi kutroi, respectively, which have been taken to mean the pitchers and the pots, and to have reference to some part of the wine-making ceremony. However, now that we need no longer see the mystic festival of Anthistaria as a mere vine harvesting or wine-making jollification, we can find a much more meaningful significance in the names of its various parts. The second day's designation, hoi kois, read as a singular noun and article, is remarkably reminiscent of the oshkos ceremony just mentioned, where the objects carried are the vine clusters of Dionysus. The name kutroi, given to the third day of the Anastaria festival, is cognate with the Semitic kotereth, mushroom, the Greek word kutros, pot, with which the name has been hitherto identified, comes also from the same ultimate source, Sumerian, gutar, top of the head, phallus, but is probably secondary, referring to the mushroom or phallic shape of the container. And turning to the name of the feast itself, Anthistaria, we may now find its source in a Sumerian phrase meaning raising of the penis, Anta Ashtar, where penis will have its dual sense in the cult of the male organ and the phallic mushroom. That both aspects of the word were involved is indicated by the fact that the festival included a ritual marriage between the god Dionysus and the wife of the archon, or chief magistrate. It is said to have involved a solemnization and consummation of this mystic union, but exactly what physically took place we cannot know. The part played by cultic prostitutes in the mushroom-raising ceremonies we have earlier discussed, and something of the kind probably lay behind his holy marriage between the god and his mortal priestess. Recalling that the exposure of the female genitals and application of menstrual blood was considered an essential part of releasing the fungus. It is worth noting that one, at least, of the days of the Anastaria was marked as taboo, Mayara, properly bloodstained. A further confirmation of this is the tradition that on the day of Chois, the celebrants anointed their doors with pitch, whose relationship with menstrual blood in the ancient philosophies has been previously noted. One is reminded also of the prophylactic daubing of doorposts and lintels with the blood of the Passover lamb by the Israelites in Egypt. The invocation and the Lord's Prayer. The cultic cry of the Bacchanalites was the paean, Alulu, Alulu. The elements of this invocation can now be traced back to the same Sumerian words that gave Hebrews the name of their deity, Elohim, translated God in our Bibles. It was a combination of Sumerian bala, strong water, juice, and iua, juice of fecundity, spermatoza. In other words, the common Semitic name for God, El, combined with the tribal god name, Yahweh, Jehovah, in the invocation of the original FLA is doubled, and it is precisely this form that came down in the Bible in the chant of praise, Hallelujah. The cry Elelu, Elelu was so marked a feature of the Bacchic rites that the Bacchanalites became known as the Eladides, and the chant itself of the Paeanon, and associated with Apollo, who had the same epithet, Paion, in Greek. The word, as we saw earlier, is another name of the mushroom, the equivalent of the New Testament's Bar Jonah, Peter's surname. Now we can understand a reference in the botanist Dioscorides' account of the plant he calls hellebore, but which we can identify with the mushroom. When they dig it in the stand, praying to Apollo and Asclepius, the latter is also a name for the hellebore and means simply head of the erect penis, the glans, or in mushroom terms, the cap. Clearly, at the point when the sacred fungus was removed from the ground, or perhaps when it was being induced to rise, celebrants were required to chant to the Paeanon, to the god of the mushroom, Elelu, Elelu. In the Easter story of the New Testament, the same incantory expression is found, put into the mouth of the Jesus figure, displayed as the mushroom on the cross. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. The name Elijah is formed of the same elements as the divine name, Elohani, and the Bacchic cry, Elelu, and was doubtless intended to serve as a clue to the preceding cryptograph. The words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, but dubiously mean, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? As every Semitist knows, the translation is another of the New Testament false renderings of special cultic names or invocations, culled this time from the well-known passage in Psalm 22. The Hebrew here is nowhere rendered by the words Phabai, lama sabachthani, which on any count are strange Aramaic. The allusion in the text to the psalm is but a cover. Lama sabachthani is a clever approximation to the important Sumerian name of the sacred mushroom. Source by wordplay of so much of the New Testament myth. This is the second, or Asclepius part of the incantation Dioscorides says was pronounced by those cutting the hellebore. The whole secret invocatory phrase, of which classical tradition brought down only the first part, was a colloquial equivalent of an original Sumerian, la jaya, la ua, lai mash. End of chapter 17, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.